They laughed when she said he would walk again, but no one in that room was laughing 10 minutes later. The chandelier light spilled across polished marble floors, reflecting gold and glass and the quiet arrogance of people who had never been told no, the kind of room where power didn't need to raise its voice because it was already understood. And in the center of it all stood Mai, her hands still damp from the cleaning cloth she'd been holding just moments before, her uniform simple, her presence almost invisible, except for the words she had just spoken, words that did not belong in a place. Like this, he will walk, she had said softly, and the silence that followed had cracked in a laughter, sharp and dismissive, echoing against the high ceilings like a judgment already passed, a woman in silk covering her mouth as she whispered something to the man beside her, a man in a tailored suit shaking his head with a smirk that said he had seen enough of the world to know miracles didn't happen to people like her, not here, not in a house owned by Kang Ji-hyun, a name that carried weight across Seoul and beyond, a man whose presence was felt even when he wasn't speaking, standing near the far end of the room with a glass in his hand, watching, always watching, his expression unreadable, cold in a way that didn't need to be explained because everyone in that room understood what it meant to stand in front of him and be measured. And still Mai didn't lower her gaze, didn't step back, even as another voice cut through the laughter. You? Heel paralysis? The man said, his tone light but edged with mockery. Do you even know what you're saying? And for a moment, the air shifted, not because of anger, but because of something quieter, something steadier, Mai's fingers tightening slightly around the cloth before she let it fall to her side, her voice no louder than before, but somehow carrying further this time. I know what I've seen, she said, and that only made them laugh harder, because belief in a place built on contracts, and control and calculated decisions, sounded like weakness, like ignorance, like something to be dismissed. And across the room, Kang Ji-hyun's eyes flickered, just once, toward the hallway that led to his son's room, a space no guest had been allowed to enter, a space that carried a different kind of silence, one that no amount of money had been able to break, because behind that door lay Kang Min-jun, a boy who had not walked in 2 years, a boy whose world had been reduced to stillness and quiet machines and the careful routines of specialists flown in from across continents, specialists who spoke in precise terms and left with polite apologies, leaving behind nothing but more uncertainty, more unanswered questions, more nights where a father stood in the dark and listened to the sound of his own helplessness. And now, in the middle of his home, in front of people who had come to celebrate power and success and everything that could be controlled, a maid had just spoken the one thing he had stopped allowing himself to believe, and for a brief second, something almost imperceptible crossed his face, gone before anyone could name it, replaced by the same stillness that had made men twice his size lower their eyes, and he turned away, dismissing the moment with a silence that carried more weight than any command, as if what she had said did not matter, as if it could not possibly matter. And yet, as the laughter continued and the conversation shifted back to safer topics, to business and alliances and things that could be measured and predicted, Mai stood there for one heartbeat longer than she should have, her eyes not on the guests, not on the man who owned the house, but on the hallway, as if she could see through walls, as if she could hear something no one else in that room could hear. And then she moved, quietly, the way she always did, disappearing from the center of the room as easily as she had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of words that should have meant nothing. And yet, somewhere deeper in the house, past the polished floors and guarded doors, something unseen had already begun to shift. The laughter faded, but the words did not. They lingered in the air like something unfinished, something that refused to disappear no matter how quickly the room tried to move on, and down the long hallway, where the light dimmed and the marble gave way to softer carpet, Mai walked with quiet steps that made no sound, the echo of her own heartbeat louder than anything around her, past doors that remained closed, past guards who barely noticed her, because she had learned how to be unseen, how to exist in the spaces people did not look, until she reached the one door no one else entered without permission, the door that carried a different kind of silence, one that felt heavier, thicker, as if even the air inside knew it was holding something fragile, and she paused there for just a moment, her hand hovering over the handle, remembering the laughter, remembering the way they had looked at her, not with anger, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that said she did not belong in their world. And yet, slowly, she turned the handle and stepped inside, the room dim except for the soft glow of a monitor, the steady rhythm of its sound filling the quiet. And there, in the center of it all, lay Min Jun, small against the large bed, his legs still, his face calm in a way that did not feel like rest, but something closer to absence, as if he had been waiting too long for something that never came. And for a second, Mai did not move, her eyes taking in every detail, the untouched toys in the corner, the neatly folded blanket that had not been used, the way the curtains were drawn just enough to let in a thin line of light. And she stepped closer, her breath steady now, her hands no longer trembling. Because this was the part no one had seen, the part no one had laughed at, the part that belonged not to the guests or the power or the wealth, but to something older, something quieter, something she carried with her long before she ever stepped into this house. And she set down the small container she had hidden beneath her apron, the lid opening with a soft sound that released the faint scent of herbs, warm and earthy, a smell that did not belong among glass and steel and polished stone. And she reached for a bowl, filling it with warm water from the nearby sink, testing the temperature with her fingers the way she had been taught, the way her grandmother had shown her on evenings when the world outside had felt just as distant. You do not force the body, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. You remind it what it has forgotten. And Mai knelt beside the bed, gently lifting Min Jun's foot, careful, respectful, as if the smallest movement mattered, because to her it did, every inch, every second, every breath. And for a moment, the room seemed to hold its own breath with her, the steady sound of the monitor unchanged, the world outside unaware of what was happening inside this quiet space. And she lowered his foot into the warm water, her hands steady now, her voice barely more than a whisper as she spoke words that had been passed down not through books or training, but through memory and trust. It is okay, she said softly, more to the silence than to the boy. Your body remembers. And her fingers moved slowly, washing, pressing gently along the muscles, the way she had learned, the way she believed, not with urgency, but with patience, as if time itself could be persuaded to slow down. And somewhere, in the hallway, footsteps approached, measured and deliberate, the kind that did not need to hurry because they were always expected, always obeyed, and the door behind her opened without warning, the air shifting as Kang Ji-hyun stepped into the room, his presence filling the space before his voice ever did, his eyes taking in everything at once, the bowl, the water, her hands on his son, and for a single suspended moment, nothing moved, not the air, not the light, not even the quiet rhythm of the machine seemed to matter anymore, because what he was seeing did not fit into anything he understood. And Mai did not turn away, did not pull her hands back. She only looked up at him, calm, unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. And in that silence, something invisible shifted between them, something that neither of them could yet name. If you believe you can fix what the best doctors in the world could not, then you had better not be wrong, Kang Ji-hyun said, his voice low, controlled, the kind of calm that carried more weight than anger ever could. And the words did not echo. They settled into the room like something final, something that demanded an answer. But Mai did not rush to speak, her hands still resting in the warm water, still holding Min Jun's foot with the same care she had shown before the door opened, before she was seen, before the air shifted. And for a moment, it was not the powerful man standing behind her that filled the space. It was the quiet presence of a child who had not moved in 2 years, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the stillness that had become his world. And only then did she lift her eyes to meet Kang Ji-hyun's gaze. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with something steadier, something that did not change even under pressure. I am not fixing him, she said softly, each word clear, unhurried. I am reminding his body how to move, and the simplicity of it hung there, almost fragile, almost impossible, because nothing in his world had ever been that simple. Not the deals, not the power, not the choices he had made to build everything that stood around them. And certainly not this. Not his son lying motionless on a bed that cost more than most people's homes. Surrounded by machines that had promised answers and delivered none. And for a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but something closer to hesitation. Something he did not allow often. And his gaze dropped to her hands, to the water, to the slow, deliberate movements that showed no panic, no desperation, only patience. And it unsettled him more than any bold claim could have. Because desperation, he understood. He had seen it, used it, controlled it. But this quiet certainty, this refusal to perform for him, to prove anything in that moment, it did not fit into any pattern he recognized. And behind him, one of the guards shifted slightly, waiting, unsure, because this was the part where orders were usually given, where decisions were made quickly and without question, but none came, and the silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy, as if the room itself was waiting for something to break it. And Mai returned her attention to Minjun, her fingers pressing gently along his foot, along the muscles that had forgotten what it meant to respond, her voice dropping again into that soft rhythm that did not demand attention but held it anyway. "You are not broken," she murmured, her words meant for the boy but carrying through the space. "You are only asleep in a place no one has reached yet." And Kang Ji-hyun's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly because those words touched something he had buried, something he had refused to name, the quiet fear that maybe there was no place left to reach, that everything that could be done had already been done. And still he did not interrupt, did not stop her, because stopping her would mean closing the door completely. And for the first time in a long time, he was not certain he wanted to do that. And then, so small it could have been imagined, so subtle it could have been missed if anyone had blinked at the wrong moment. Minjun's toes shifted just barely, a movement so slight it did not change the room, did not alter the machines, did not announce itself with any sound, but it was there, real, undeniable, and I did not react, did not gasp, did not even pause, because to her it was not a miracle. It was a beginning, but behind her, Kang Jae-hyun stilled completely, his breath catching for the first time, his eyes fixed on that tiny movement as if the entire world had narrowed down to that one impossible detail. And in that instant, everything he believed about control, about certainty, about what could and could not be changed, faltered, just enough to let something else take its place, something quieter, more dangerous in its own way, hope. And he did not speak, because there were no words that could hold what he had just seen, only the weight of it settling into. The silence, as the room seemed to hold its breath once more. The room did not celebrate the movement. It did not erupt into disbelief or relief. It simply went still, the kind of stillness that comes when something too fragile to touch has just appeared, and Kang Ji-hyun did not move, not forward, not back, as if even the smallest shift might undo what he had just seen, his eyes fixed on his son's foot as though the world outside that single detail had ceased to exist. And for the first time in years, the certainty that had built his empire, that had protected him, that had defined him, wavered, not shattered, but cracked just enough to let something unfamiliar pass through. And behind him, the guard who had been waiting for orders lowered his gaze, uncertain now, because this was not a situation that followed rules. This was not something that could be controlled with a command or resolved with precision. And still, no one spoke, because there was nothing to say that would not break the moment. And Mai continued, her hands steady, her movements unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if this was exactly what she had expected. And in that quiet consistency, there was something even more unsettling than the movement itself, because it suggested that this impossible shift was not an accident, not a coincidence, but part of something she understood in a way no one else in that house did. And Kang Jae-hyun's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge, not soft, never soft, but measured in a different way. "Do it again," he said, not as a command meant to assert control, but as a request that betrayed the smallest hint of something beneath it. And Mai did not look at him, did not acknowledge the weight of his words. She simply adjusted her grip, her fingers pressing gently along the same path, patient, deliberate, as if she were following a map only she could see. "It is not something you repeat," she said, her tone calm, unwavering. "It is something you allow." And that answer, simple as it was, would have sounded like defiance in any other moment. But here, in this room, with that single movement still echoing in the air, it carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need permission. And Kang Ji-hyun's jaw tightened again, not in anger, but in the effort to hold on to the structure of a world that was beginning to shift beneath him, because allowing meant surrender, even if only a little, and surrender was not something he had ever built his life around. And yet he did not stop her, did not interrupt, because stopping her would mean choosing certainty over possibility. And for the first time, possibility felt heavier, more dangerous than anything he had faced before. And as the minutes passed, stretching in a silence that felt both long and fleeting, Minjun's foot remained in her hands, the warmth of the water slowly fading, replaced by the quiet persistence of her touch. And then, again, so slight it could have been dismissed, the toes shifted once more, not as much as before, not enough to prove anything to anyone who needed proof, but enough to confirm what he had already seen, enough to deepen the crack in the certainty he had carried for so long. And this time, Kang Ji-hyun exhaled, a sound so controlled it barely existed. But it marked a change, a boundary crossed without announcement, and he turned slightly, his voice returning, but different now, directed not at Mai, but at the guard. Behind him, "No one comes in," he said, each word precise, final, "and no one speaks about this." And the guard nodded immediately, relief and confusion mixing in equal measure as he stepped back, closing the door softly behind him, sealing the room away from the rest of the house, from the laughter that had filled it earlier, from the world that operated on rules and expectations, leaving only the three of them in that quiet space. And for a moment, Kang Ji-hyun remained where he stood, watching, learning in a way he had never allowed himself to before he moved slowly, deliberately, not toward control, not toward command, but closer to the bed, stopping just within reach, his gaze lowering to his son, then lifting again to Mai. And when he spoke, there was no trace of dismissal left. Only something quieter, heavier, something that had been earned in the span of a few impossible seconds. "Continue," he said, and the word did not sound like an order. It sounded like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. And the room, once again, fell into silence, but this time, it was not empty, it was waiting. Time did not rush inside that room. It stretched, softened, bending itself around each quiet movement of her hands, and Kang Ji-hyun began to understand something he had never allowed before, that control did not always come from force. Sometimes it came from restraint, from watching without interrupting, from letting something unfamiliar unfold without trying to reshape it into something known. And he stood there, closer now than he had been in months, not as the man who owned the house, not as the man others feared, but as a father standing beside his son, his gaze moving between Minjun's face and Maya's hands, studying every detail as if committing it to memory, the warmth of the water now replaced by the slow rhythm of her touch, her fingers pressing along the muscles with quiet consistency, never rushing, never hesitating. And in that rhythm, there was a steadiness that seemed to reach beyond the physical, something that did not belong to science or instruction manuals or expert opinions, something older, something patient. And Kang Ji-hyun's voice, when it came again, was lower, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, not because he doubted her, but because he needed to understand what he was witnessing, needed to place it somewhere within the framework of his world. And for the first time since he entered the room, Mai paused, not withdrawing her hands, not breaking the contact, but allowing a single breath to pass before she answered, her eyes still on Minjun. "My grandmother," she said simply, and there was no embellishment, no attempt to make it sound more than it was, because to her it did not need to be more. It was enough, and the answer lingered between them, not impressive, not complex, but somehow heavier than any list of credentials could have been, because it carried something those credentials did not. experience shaped by care rather than authority, and Kang Jihyun nodded once, a small movement, but one that marked another shift, another boundary quietly crossed, because he did not dismiss her answer, did not question it further, and that alone changed the balance in the room. And as the minutes continued to pass, something subtle began to change in Min Jun's expression, not a full reaction, not something that could be easily named, but a softening, a slight shift in the tension that had settled into his features over time, as if somewhere deep within, something was responding, slowly, cautiously, like a memory being called back into focus. And Mai leaned closer, her voice dropping even further, a gentle murmur that filled the space without demanding. "Attention, you are not alone," she whispered, her words simple, steady, and Kang Ji-hyun felt something tighten in his chest at the sound of it, because those were words he had not known how to say, not in a way that reached beyond the surface, not in a way that could bridge the distance that had grown between him and his son, and he watched as her hand moved again, tracing the same path, repeating the same motion with quiet faith, and then, without warning, Min Jun's foot shifted more clearly this time, not just a slight movement of the toes, but a faint lift, barely an inch, barely enough to be seen unless one was watching closely, but Kang Ji-hyun was watching, every part of him focused on that single detail, and this time he did not remain still, his breath catching as he stepped forward, closing the distance completely, his hand hovering just above the edge of the bed as if he did not trust himself to touch, to interfere, to break whatever fragile process was unfolding before him. And the room seemed to narrow around that moment, everything else fading into the background, the world outside reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. And for a second, he closed his eyes, not in disbelief, but in something deeper, something closer to release. Because what he had been holding for so long, the weight of unanswered questions, of silent nights, of hope buried under certainty, began to loosen its grip, just enough to let something else take its place. And when he opened his eyes again, they did not carry the same cold distance they had before. They carried something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken. And he looked at Mai, not as someone beneath him, not as someone invisible, but as someone standing at the center of something he could not control. And for the first time, he did not try to control it. He simply stood there, present, watching, allowing, as the silence settled once more, no longer empty, but full of something that had not existed in that room for a very long time. The air in the room felt different now, not lighter, not yet, but changed in a way that could not be reversed, as if something unseen had been set in motion and would not be stopped by doubt or reason or the rules that had governed this house for years. And Kang Ji-hyun remained beside the bed, closer than he had allowed himself to be in a long time, his presence no longer distant, no longer guarded in the same way, his eyes fixed on every movement, every subtle response that passed through. His son's body like a quiet signal returning from a place long unreachable. And for the first time, he did not measure the moment by outcome. He did not calculate or anticipate. He simply witnessed, and that alone marked a shift greater than any visible change. And Mai continued without interruption, her hand steady, her rhythm unchanged, as if she trusted something beyond what could be seen, her voice low and consistent, weaving through the silence with a calm that did not ask for permission. "You are remembering," she murmured softly, her fingers pressing along the same path. Again, slower now, deeper in a way that did not force but invited, and Min Jun's breathing changed just slightly, not enough to alarm, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to be noticed by someone who had spent years watching for even the smallest difference. And Kang Ji-hyun noticed, every detail imprinting itself into his awareness, the way the boy's chest rose just a fraction more, the way his shoulders relaxed in a way they had not before, and something inside him responded, something instinctive, something he had buried beneath control and discipline. And he reached out, his hand hovering once again before finally, carefully, he placed it on the edge of the bed, not touching his son yet, but closer than he had been, as if proximity itself required permission. And he spoke, not to command, not to question, but to understand, What happens next? He asked quietly, and this time, Mai answered without pause, her tone unchanged. We wait, she said, and the simplicity of it settled over him like a challenge, because waiting had always meant uncertainty, and uncertainty had always been something he eliminated, not embraced. And yet here, in this room, waiting was the only thing that made sense, and he did not argue, did not push for more, because something within him had already begun to accept that this process did not belong to his rules. And as the minutes stretched again, slow and deliberate, Min Jun's foot responded once more, not a full movement, not something that would satisfy a room full of experts, but something undeniable, a faint shift that carried intention. And this time, Kang Ji-hyun did not hold back, his breath releasing as he stepped closer, his hand finally resting gently beside his son's leg, not interfering, not guiding, but present, fully present. And his voice, when it came again, was quieter than it had ever been, stripped of everything but the truth beneath it. Min Jun, he said softly, and the name filled the room in a way it had not in months. Not as a call that expected no answer, but as something offered, something hopeful. And for a moment, nothing happened, the silence returning, steady, unbroken. And then, slowly, Min Jun's toes curled again, more clearly this time, a response that did not need interpretation, and Kang Jae-hyun froze. Not out of fear, but out of realization, because this was no longer something he could dismiss, no longer something he could explain away. And he looked at Mai, truly looked at her, seeing not a maid, not an employee, but a presence that had shifted something fundamental within his world. And he did not speak because words would have been too small for what he was beginning to understand. And instead, he remained there, his hand still near his son, his gaze steady, his control no longer about dominance, but about restraint, about allowing something greater than his own certainty to exist. And in that quiet, fragile space, something new took root, not loud, not overwhelming, but undeniable. And the room, once defined by absence, now held something it had not in years, the beginning of return. The moment did not pass. It deepened, settling into the walls, into the quiet hum of the machines, into the space between every breath taken in that room. And Kang Ji-hyun remained exactly where he was, his hand resting near his son, not touching, not guiding, but no longer distant, no longer removed from what was unfolding. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like an observer in his own life. He felt present, fully and undeniably present, and that presence carried a weight he had not prepared for, because it meant he could no longer hide behind certainty, no longer retreat into control. And as he stood there, watching, something shifted again, not in Min Jun's body this time, but in the atmosphere itself, in the way the silence no longer felt empty, in the way it seemed to hold something fragile but growing, something that demanded patience. And Mai did not stop, her hands continuing their quiet work, her voice soft but steady, threading through the stillness with a calm that did not waver. You are safe, she whispered, her words simple, grounding, and Kang Jae-hyun felt them more than he heard them, because they carried a truth he had not known how to give, not in a way that reached beyond protection, beyond structure, beyond everything he had built to shield his son from the world. And he realized, in that quiet, that safety was not only about keeping harm away, it was about being seen, being reached, being understood in a place no one else had touched. And that realization settled heavily within him, not as regret, but as awareness. And for a moment he closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to feel, to allow himself to exist in this space without control, without expectation. And when he opened them, Min Jun's foot moved again, clearer this time, a slow, uncertain lift followed by a slight curl of the toes, not strong, not steady, but intentional. And Kang Ji-hyun's breath caught, his body reacting before his mind could, his hand instinctively shifting closer, stopping just short of contact, as if he feared breaking something too delicate to touch. And his voice, when it came, was no longer controlled in the same way. It carried something raw, something real. Min Jun, he said again, softer this time, The name no longer a call into silence, but an offering into possibility, and the room seemed to listen with him, every second stretching as they waited. And then, slowly, Min Jun's head shifted just slightly against the pillow, a movement so small it might have been dismissed before, but not now, not after everything that had already changed, and Kang Ji-hyun froze, his entire world narrowing to that single motion, because this was no longer just a reaction, it was a response, and he felt something break open within him, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, and he turned his head, his gaze finding Mai, not with questions, not with doubt, but with something entirely different, something that had never been directed at her before, respect, and it settled between them without words. Heavy and undeniable because nothing needed to be said to confirm what had already happened, and for the first time, Kang Ji-hyun lowered himself slightly, not fully, not in surrender, but enough to bring himself closer to the level of the bed, closer to his son, closer to the moment he had almost given up on, and he stayed there, his presence no longer towering, no longer distant, but grounded, connected, and, as Mai continued, her hands unwavering, her belief unchanged, the room held its breath once more, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but out of something new, something that had not existed here before. And in that silence, the distance between power and humility, between control and trust, began to dissolve, not completely, not all at once, but enough to change everything that would come next. The silence no longer felt fragile, it felt deliberate, as if the room itself had chosen to protect what was happening within it, and Kang Ji-hyun remained lowered beside the bed, no longer standing above the moment, but inside it, his presence grounded in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had seen him just hours before, and his eyes did not leave his son. Every subtle movement, every breath, every flicker of response, becoming something he held onto with quiet intensity, not out of desperation, but out of a growing awareness that this was something he could not command, only witness. And across from him, Mai continued with the same steady rhythm, her hands moving with patience that did not falter, her belief unchanged, untouched by the weight of the man in the room or the power he carried outside of it. And her voice remained low, a soft current beneath the silence. "Stay with us," she whispered gently, her words simple but anchored, and Min Jun's fingers twitched slightly against the blanket, a movement so faint it would have gone unnoticed before, but now it carried meaning, intention, and Kang Ji-hyun saw it, felt it, the shift not just in his son, but in himself, because something inside him was no longer resisting what he could not explain, it was accepting it, allowing it to exist without needing to control it, and he leaned closer, his hand finally resting lightly against the edge of the mattress near Min Jun's arm, not touching yet, but close enough to feel the warmth, close enough to be part of the moment. And for the first time, he spoke not as a man used to being obeyed, but as a father who had waited too long to be heard. "I am here," he said quietly, the words unfamiliar but true, and the room seemed to respond to that, not with sound, but with a deepening stillness, as if everything was aligning around that single truth. And then, slowly, Min Jun's hand shifted, just slightly, his fingers curling inward as if reaching for something, and Kang Ji-hyun froze, his breath catching again. But this time he did not hesitate, he did not hold back, his hand moving gently, carefully, until it rested over his son's, not gripping, not forcing, just present. Just there, and the contact was small, simple, but it carried something neither of them had felt in a long time, connection. And for a moment, nothing else mattered, not the house, not the guests, not the power or the expectations waiting beyond that door. Only this quiet exchange between a father and his son, guided by a woman who had walked into their lives unnoticed and changed everything without asking for recognition. And Kang Ji-hyun's gaze lifted again, finding Mai, and this time there was no distance left in it. No trace of dismissal, only a silent acknowledgement that what she was doing could not be measured by anything he understood. And he gave a small nod, not an order, not a command, but something closer to trust, and she returned it with nothing more than continued focus, her hands never leaving their work, her presence steady as the room held onto this new rhythm, and beyond the closed door, the world continued as it always had, unaware that inside this quiet space, something irreversible had begun, something that would not only change a child's body, but a man's understanding of power, of control, of what it truly meant to protect what mattered most. And as Min Jun's fingers tightened ever so slightly beneath his father's hand, the room did not celebrate. It did not break the silence. It simply held the moment, letting it settle, letting it grow, because some changes did not need to be announced, they only needed to be witnessed. The moment did not end. It settled, deep and quiet, like something the room itself chose to remember. And Kang Ji-hyun did not move his hand from his son's, not because he was afraid to let go, but because for the first time, he understood what it meant to truly hold on, not with force, not with control, but with presence. And Min Jun's fingers remained curled faintly against his, a small, steady contact that spoke, louder than any words that had filled this house in the past 2 years. And across from them, Mai slowly lifted her hands from the water, the last drops falling back into the bowl with soft, almost ceremonial sounds, her movements unhurried, respectful, as if she understood that what had happened did not need to be rushed into anything more. And the room breathed again, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet expansion that carried something new, something undeniable. And Kang Jae-hyun looked down at his son, really looked, seeing not the stillness that had defined him for so long, but the faint signs of return, the subtle shifts, the life that had begun to answer back. And when he spoke, his voice was different, stripped of distance, stripped of authority, carrying only truth. "You came back to me," he said softly, not as a statement of certainty, but as something fragile, something he was still learning to believe. And Min Jun did not respond with words, not yet, but his fingers tightened just slightly again, a small pressure against his father's hand that said more than any voice could. And Kang Ji-hyun closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to hold back emotion, but to allow it, to let something he had buried beneath years of control finally surface. And when he opened them, he turned to Mai, his gaze steady, no longer searching, no longer questioning, but acknowledging fully and without hesitation. And he stood slowly, not rising back into the distance he once held, but carrying this moment with him, his posture unchanged yet somehow different, because what stood there now was not only a man of power, but a man who had witnessed something greater than it. And he spoke, his voice calm, measured, but no longer distant. From this moment on, he said, each word deliberate, "You are not staff in this house." And the air shifted slightly, not with tension, but with recognition, because this was not an order given lightly. This was a line being redrawn. And he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "You are under my protection." And the words did not carry ownership. They carried respect, something earned, something given without condition. And Mai did not react with surprise, did not step back or lower her eyes. She simply met his gaze with the same quiet steadiness she had held from the beginning, because for her, nothing had changed in what mattered, the work, the care, the belief. And Kang Ji-hyun nodded once, a small gesture, but one that sealed what had already been understood. And he turned back to his son, his hand returning gently, naturally, as if it had always belonged there. And the room fell into silence once more, but this time, it was not waiting, it was settled, grounded in something that no longer needed to prove itself. And beyond the walls of that house, the world would continue to measure power in wealth, in influence, in control. But inside that room, a different measure had taken its place, one that could not be bought, could not be forced, only earned through something far quieter, far stronger. And as Min Jun's fingers rested against his father's, and Mai stood beside them, steady and unseen no longer, the truth of that moment remained, unspoken but undeniable. In that day, the world inside that house remembered what dignity looks like.